Hello, everybody, to the second episode of the Tyranid Masterclass here on Hive Fleet Prometheus. Today, we're going to be going over maps, terrain placement, deployment, and then I'm going to go through some of the pictures of some of my previous games and talk about just kind of some decision making going forward on turn one. And I'm going to try to extrapolate and remember as well as I can sort of my decision-making process based off of the units that I can see on the board. I don't remember the exact lists, but I do have the scores in Tabletop Battles, which is a free app on your phone. That also is a fantastic resource. It allows you to keep track of your scoring other than just on a pad of paper or on a vinyl score sheet. It's been game-changing for me. I've been using it for about the past 2.5 years. So I'm just going to pull up here, assuming that you have the tactical cards from the Leviathan box set or you bought them alternatively from the GW website. There are 5 different types of deployment cards that you can draw. So here we can see that all of them, as I said, have 5 objectives. This is a change from last edition where I believe at the beginning of 9th edition, the majority of maps actually had 6 objectives. I think it was about a 55-45 or a 60-40 split. So it was a lot easier to max your primary. The scoring also changed, and now it is 50 primary and 40 secondary points. So GW has changed the layout to lean more into controlling the board and now, when looking at these maps, depending on the angle of which your armies are going to be facing each other, that's the general direction that you want to be placing the flattest, broadest areas of your terrain pieces, like your ruins. When I look at these map types, there's one in general that kind of sticks out as a sore thumb when it comes to Tyranid play, and that would be Hammer and Anvil, the one in the middle on the left here. Playing long table for us is difficult. A lot of our weaponry is 18 to 36 inches, unless you're counting rupture cannons from the Tyranid or other special exceptions if you include the movement of the model with it. There are plenty of armies that have 48 to 72 inch guns, Astra Militarum, Space Marines, Necrons, Knights. There are plenty of armies that on this map type, if you draw it randomly, you're going to be at a disadvantage. That's something you have to think about from the beginning. The units that you're going to need to keep alive, like your linchpin units, your hive tyrants, your tervigons, things that are your force multiplier that you need to keep alive, your synapse. You want to set up terrain so it benefits you, so that it covers the majority of your deployment, and you have some play on the first 18 inches of the board that you place models. The midfield is just going to be a hack and slash brawl. You're going to have to be prepared for that. Units that I would stereotypically call pawns, like Neurogaunts, Termagants, Hormagaunts, Gargoyles, even warriors. I would almost say that warriors are sort of your rooks in the chessboard of this game. They are also going to have to go out and they're going to have to fight for the middle of the table here. So the terrain placement in the middle of the table also wants to be clustered enough that you can make normal movements on average 6 inches with a minor advance or 6 inches and a charge and get to another terrain piece and hide or engage with another enemy unit. Another reason I think this deployment type is the toughest for us is for things like deep strikers or things coming in from reserve or seeding a spore mine or moving things into range to move block. It will be easier in that respect, but your opponent can also do the same to you. They can move block you. On this map specifically, if you were to count the number of inches that have encounter ability, just starting with things on the board, it's the least. It's 44 inches. It's a straight line, it's narrow, it's kind of corridor fighting for in a 40k sense. The other maps, if you measure, I don't know the exact measurement, but because of the parallax of diagonals and the long and short deployment on Search and Destroy, you have a lot more angles and the ability to interact with units other than just in a head-to-head battle. There's a 20% chance that if you draw cards randomly, that you're going to get stuck with Hammer and Anvil, and you have to change your thinking of how you're going to interact with the game pretty much immediately. If your style of play is kind of aggressive hack and slash, You might do really well on Hammer and Anvil with Vanguard detachments. They want to kind of go up to get into the fray. And if you have a commanding presence in the middle of the board, sometimes your opponent won't be able to counter, especially against armies like Tau or things that kind of gain their benefits in the later part of the game. I would say of my favorite deployment types here, it would be Search and Destroy, just because a lot of the time, you have a strong foothold in either home objective. That's not normally a concern of mine. The only time that I think about trying to get over and control that objective is with gargoyles. If they deploy too far forward, you can actually deep strike your gargoyles outside 9 inches in the far corner of their deployment zone. And then after shooting, you can move them 6 inches so that hopefully the OC of your gargoyles is more than the units that were staying home on the objective to defend it. Especially on a turn, if you draw capture enemy objective, that's 8 victory points. That's the most that you can gain outside of investigate signals and bring it down. That's very contingent on you being able to kill a lot of vehicles, or investigate signals is having units that are potentially expendable that can be in all 4 corners of the board. If you have a detachment ability that allows you to redeploy, such as Vanguard, you can redeploy 3 Vanguard units after the roll-off for who gets first turn. With Invasion Fleet, it's before the roll-off. You can set up units that you would think would be high priority targets for your opponent on one board edge, and you can kind of telegraph that you're going to want to go for a certain objective, and then before the turn starts or after first turn has been determined, you can redeploy those units to an opposite side of the board. You can create a false front. I don't necessarily see that as a advanced tactic, and I don't know if people necessarily use that a lot, but in the mini game of deployment, I think a less experienced player, and I would consider less experienced less than 20 or 30 lifetime games. I don't think it's something that's thought about a whole lot. It's just, let's just get my models on the table. I've got 3 or 4 hours to burn. Let's just roll some dice. Let's get through it. And they think the game starts after the first roll off of the turn. Deployment is a mini game. So my perspective on playing this mini game of deployment is I want to secure my place on the board as early as possible, and I want to deny my opponent as much room on the board similarly. So units that can forward deploy or scout, in my opinion, should be placed first. It makes it so that other enemy units that have a forward deploy or a scout ability have to be outside 9 before they move or when they're placed. Things like Lictors, Neurolictors, Death Leaper, anything that forward deploys, essentially has a 9-inch bubble of no other enemy units can be placed here. Those first units on the board come after you declare reserves. So you declare all reserves and all deep strike, and then you place 1 unit on the board. If you roll off for defender, you're the one who chooses table side, and you place the first unit on the board. Units I would probably place secondarily after your forward deploy is things that need to be on the line that have scout movements. Gene Stealers, I think, are one of the only ones we have that can do that. Things that have very high movement and need to go places like Gargoyles, Raveners, Warriors with a Tyranid Prime. If you are putting Zoanthropes on the board, I do think they should be as far forward as possible behind cover because they only have a 5-inch move. And then I think the tertiary units that you should be placing are your hard-hitting units and your linchpins. You should be trying to see as many units your opponent can put on the board and see what their board state is going to be, assuming you've asked them if they have a redeploy, and what they put on the board has to stay there. One of the things I particularly look for is if they're going to castle up and have a bunch of synergies that are going to all move forward together. Necron Warrior Blob or Immortal Blob, something of that sort. Alternatively, I'm trying to see if they're trying to put units on one side of the board to telegraph that they're going to have a strong presence on 1 or 2 of these center objectives on the board. At that point, I can look at my home field objective, the refused objective that is on the board, and see where is going to be the majority of my firepower and my fighting going to be. To sum up the deployment minigame, you want to put things with as little intel for your opponent to know what your plan is as you're placing them as possible, while also forcing them, if they have less units than you, to give you as much information as possible on what they're telegraphing their game plan to be. So what I think I'm going to do now is I'm going to pull up a photo of a board type from one of my very first games of 5th edition back in 2010. It was my buddy's Space Wolves versus my Tyranids. A lot of stuff wasn't painted. We didn't have a game shop around that was easily accessible. So a lot of the terrain that we had at our disposal were energy drink cans, pieces of cardboard that I super glued together, or some eBay terrain that I ended up ordering and keeping around just in case we had the free time to play a game. So here's an example of a board state that you don't want. The ruin pieces that we did have, I honestly, it's been so long, I can't remember whose choice it was to throw them essentially in opposite corners of the board. My game plan at that time was I thought Tyranids were only a swarm army, and so I had loads of Hormigons and loads of Termagants. I had, 2 Carnifexes, a Lictor, and a Hive Tyrant. So this is an example of something that you don't want to do. And I believe this is, I can't even remember if this is from the same game. Oh, I think it was. I forgot even had a Trigon, or I had a homemade Tyrannocyte with Zoanthropes to deep strike in. So here is a picture of my first game against Eldar. It was actually my first game of 10th edition in general. I was a little nervous going into this game. I had a pretty good understanding of the rules at that point and a pretty good understanding of how powerful certain units were. I took some Exocrines, 2 Biovores, 2 Lictors, Hive Tyrant with Tyrant Guard, 2 Acid Spray Tyrannofexes, a Malceptor, I think 3 units of 3 Zoanthropes, 2 squads of 10 Gargoyles. There might have been some other units sprinkled in there that I can't quite remember, but that's the gist of the list, invasion style list. We were playing that the first floor of all of these ruins were ITC windows that you couldn't see through. The way that I set up the terrain here is you want things as perfectly mirrored as possible. And here I'm going to go ahead and outline all of the pieces of terrain that I laid on the field, just so you can see it in higher contrast. Fun little brain hack, you remember things better in color. So I'm going to try to go through here and show how I try to make the board as equal as possible when it comes to cover dependent on the deployment zone. So this deployment type, I think it's not sweeping engagement, it's the diagonals. It's halfway up the board edge and the corner, and then halfway up the board edge here and the corner here. When deploying your units, assuming you don't have a redeploy, you have to look at all of the widest angles that a unit can be placed or can move to shoot around or behind a ruin. So I'm going to put that on here with blue lines. And it's going to look something hellish like this. Now, all of these are the widest angles that something could get a cheeky shot behind the ruins. The Goldilocks zone here for you to place your models to be completely safe, in general, is outlined in green here. This is part of the reason why I like this deployment type. It offers the widest angle for you to hide units. If there's bases for models or a multitude of units, if you're playing Endless Swarm, that you don't feel that you can hide in those Goldilocks zones, then you can start thinking about, do I need to put this off the board? I'm going to gain more value from a unit that comes onto the board and helps me later, rather than it dying immediately. That's also contingent on who you're playing. If you're playing against Astra Militarum, they've got a bunch of indirect fire, you might just want to put as much stuff on the board as possible to have target saturation. One of the best things I ever learned from a really great player that I used to play with, Ben Neal. I believe in 2022 he won 7th at LVO with Grey Knights, and I played against his list as a learning game with Tyranids. He told me that every unit has action economy. It's just like Dungeons and Dragons if you play it. So every model that you take off the board that's action economy, that they lose longitudinally for the rest of the game unless you can regenerate it. So there is no such thing as overkill. That's another thing that he taught me. Taking one full unit off the board, they lose a percentage of their efficiency for the rest of the game. It's better than doing some wounds here, dabbling, hurting a couple of units, and letting those things run off and hide, capture objectives, and still effectively have the same impact, even if you did a couple wounds to them. And I believe I did get turn 1. I was able to advance all of my big creatures. The Tyrannofexes moved 9, the Malceptor moves 8. I had some pretty average or more than average advances. I moved them up, and then I had a 6-inch spacing between all of them, so that they all had assault and fire. I found it very quickly that the Eldar Walkers are T7 and -1 wound, so they were not the thing to kill to win this game. The thing to kill at this point was I can move block him, even though he has more movement on his units. But all my monsters have OC 3, 4, or 5, not including the Zone Thropes, the Hive Tyrant, the Tyrant Guard, or the Gargoyles. So I had a slight advantage when it came to objective control. In order to sort of tip that scale more, I knew that if every model of his that I can take off the board that he can't regenerate, I win the objective control war. So those Tyrannifexes, the Exocrines, the Zone Thropes, all of them went into the infantry. I don't think I put a single shot after the original Overwatch on the War Walkers when I was wounding them on 6s, because it's strength 7 on T7 with a -1 to wound. Looking at what he brought, he didn't bring 3 Fire Prisms, thank God. I think he kind of knew right out the gate that it wasn't going to be a super great game if he did field those. He brought some War Walkers, he had a bunch of infantry, he had some light vehicles, and the 3 grav tanks you see were actually Night Spinners. So he was able to do a lot of damage, even if I was trying to hide my models. And so that factored into how I attempted to move my models as well. Just looking at the board state, outside of the grav tanks, which I think had the same or less OC than my monsters, I wasn't necessarily worried about killing them. They were going to do chip damage to me all game. The things that I needed to eliminate was his OC, his ability to control objectives. So either via move blocking with my bases, or by killing his infantry, I thought that I could pretty handily control the game. You don't see it super well up here, but my gargoyles started on the board and they flew up to be on the opposite side of the War Walker here. I did end up winning this game. He also was kind enough to not bring 3 Fire Prisms. He brought Night Spinners instead, which I was totally fine with. I felt like I could deal with that a lot more because the strength of the weapon is 7. Sure, it can shoot out of line of sight and has devastating wounds, but between the Feel No Pains I was able to hand out and the board control I felt I had the entire time, I didn't feel like it was unfair at all. I brought something that I thought was a little experimental, but I thought it was going to be a good sort of, beginner invasion fleet. So I think the other thing here was the relative level of experience. This person had not played a whole lot of games of ninth. They had a great handling of the rules, but I think it was just familiarity with the game. I did tell him about the Overwatch changes, that if he moves something within range of a weapon up to 24 inches, that I was probably going Overwatch. I also made him aware of the Hive Tyrant's ability to give me a stratagem for free. This was before the battle tactic change. So effectively, I had a majority of the board covered with Overwatch from the Tyranifexes, and then also anything that I thought was a additional threat to my objective control, I pumped those extra shots into the infantry. And I can't remember the exact score. I think I won something like 71 to 64. Relatively high scoring game for first game of 10th. Also, a win against Eldar. Rolling up to a table against an army that, all the averages, all the rules are kind of stacked against you. How you pilot the army matters just as much. And here I think I did a better than average job, especially for first game, just piloting, just getting things out there, and playing to my advantage, kind of lulling my opponent into a false sense of security, and that they came within engagement range. It was that 18 to 24 inch range here that I was able to kill the majority of the units. I think I only got into melee once with the Hive Tyrant, and that was to strip the last few wounds off a War Walker. Which I was winning on 4s, even with Twin Linked. But I was able to strip off a few extra damage on him. So I know that was a lot of information, but if there's anything that I've missed, go ahead and hit me up in the YouTube comments or on the Tyranid Discord. You can see it here. It is the Tyranid Hive. My username is Talthor on there. And I want to thank you for spending some time with me here on Hive Fleet Prometheus. Thanks.